Ask me my three main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education.
Hi everybody, Michael here. Today's video, we're going to have a deep dive into the university scam, why young people should not go, and why, if you're not at university and you're a taxpayer, you are paying for student loans. And I'm also going to teach an alternative to going to university, an alternative system we can use, and what you should do now if you're 16 years old. So let's go. Okay, so as you can see from the intro, Tony Blair, one of the most evil people in English history, said that education was the most important thing for him. And really what he means is indoctrination, and also debt slavery. And with Tony Blair being essential, a supposed wannabe communist and a Marxist in the Fabian Society, the goal of communism is to indoctrinate everybody into the state and to be mindless sheep. And as we can see, he has been very successful. The Fabian Society Marxists have been very successful. And the whole university's theme has turned out now to be a giant scam. And because of the education system being subverted, we're not taught any of this in school. And in this video, I will explain all the details that you need to know to protect yourself from falling for this scam. And before we get into crunching the numbers, I just want to explain, education is a good and important thing. But unfortunately, it has been subverted. And if you look back 30 years ago, university was actually free and it took the best of the best. So you'd have, I think it was 19% of people went 30 years ago, and they were the smartest of the smart, because obviously you need doctors and you need intelligent people to run society. You need lawyers and all that stuff. But what's happened is they're trying to get everybody into university for two reasons: so they can indoctrinate them and so they can get them into debt slavery. And with that being said, now let's crunch the numbers. Right, so let's crunch the numbers. I've got ChatGPT to help me with all the numbers. So from today, the typical tuition fees per year is £9,250. So over 3 years, it works out to be £28,000, which is crazy to me. I remember when I was young, it was people used to have a yearly tuition of like £2,000, and they would leave with 10 grand, which isn't overly that bad, even though I advise against it. But also with maintenance loans and all that, it works between 45,000 and 60,000. So I asked it to do roughly £50,000 as an average. And the key point, most students leave owing more than a small mortgage deposit. Imagine that. And this is before they've even earned a full-time salary. Okay, so let's say that you've finished uni, you've got your £50,000 debt. I asked ChatGPT to work out, if you're earning £50,000 a year, which is a good wage, how much would you pay back of your student loan? This is where the scam really, or you're going to understand the scam, and this is all to do with interest rates. But essentially, if you're earning £50,000 a year in your job, you'll pay back £2,250 per year off of your student debt. But the interesting thing, because you will have interest to pay on your loan, which is often between 4 and 7%, that works out £2,000 a year. So you're essentially not paying any of your loan back because it's getting eaten up by the interest. So for many graduates, repayments barely reduce the balance, and you can pay for years and years and end up owing more than what you started with. And that's on 50k a year. Now, obviously, we have to take into account, if you earn less, then you pay less back in terms of per year. But ultimately, the total sum never really goes down because the interest screws you over. And the whole system is absurd. And it essentially turns you into a debt slave. And as it says here, it says you can't discharge it through bankruptcy, so you're stuck with it. It follows you across jobs and careers. It's taken automatically via payroll, and it discourages risk-taking, so startups and retraining, so you can't do anything slightly risky because you've got so much debt. Now let's look at who benefits from this system. Obviously, the ideologues are going to benefit. As I said, Tony Blair and the Marxists benefit because they get to indoctrinate everyone into the system, and the banks get all their interest and all that stuff. But also the winners are the universities, because they're paid up front with no risk, and the government, because the costs are deferred decades into the futures. And losers are the middle earners between 35 and 60k, because they pay the most. They often clear late or just before the write-off, and the high earners clear it but massively overpay via interest. Now, this is the part that most people don't also understand, is that the taxpayer angle is that the taxpayer picks up a massive majority of this tab. So billions of pounds in loans are written off every year because there's a time limit that are placed on these loans. And if they're not paid off by the student or the person, then the taxpayer picks up the bill. So again, billions of pounds in loans are written off every year. The taxpayers ultimately absorb unpaid balances, so society pays anyway, just inefficiently. And a key contradiction is we shifted from tax-funded education to loan-funded education, but taxpayers still carry much of the cost, just later and messier. Okay, now next we're going to look at the psychological and human consequences of this, because I've been in debt myself and it can be a crippling thing. And not all debt is bad, okay? So if you've got a mortgage on a house, that's not necessarily that bad a debt. But obviously if you've got £50,000 in gambling debts, that's like absolute stupidity debt. So not all debts are the same, and some can be good. Like if you take a 10 grand loan and you invest it wisely and turn it into £30,000 in a few years, then that's obviously sensible debt somewhat. Okay, so the psychological and life impact are: it normalizes permanent debt, delayed home ownership, reduced career flexibility, and why bother paying extra mindset. And if you look at the delayed home ownership, I mean, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago, people would be getting homes at 23. Nowadays, once they finish uni, had a year abroad, a lot of people like to do, by the time they're 23, they're saddled with £50,000 of debt and just getting a job. And then if they're trying to buy a home or rent, they're basically just completely crippled. The prospect of owning a home with house prices now is basically virtually impossible. Okay, and one thing I want everybody to understand, or young people to understand, you have not been taught this, but let's just look at this £50,000 student debt you got in. Let's say that you went to university in the year 2020. This was around COVID. So you essentially probably had 2 of those 3 years. You couldn't really have the university experience. So you were stuck at home watching lectures on Zoom, and you paid £50,000 for the privilege. But what could you have done with £50,000? And I got ChatGPT. I said, well, some of the major assets you could have invested on. If you invested £50,000 on the 1st of January 2020, today, if you invested it in Bitcoin, you'd have £546,500. If you put it in gold, which is probably the safest asset in the world, you'd have £160,000. If you put it in silver, you'd have £122,000. If you just put it in the stock market, you'd have £107,000. If you invested in Tesla, you'd have £770,000. And even if you just put it in a boring, plain old bank account, getting 4% interest, which is the average, you'd be on £63,000. So by providing that graphic, you can see what you could have done with this money, rather than getting into debt where most people don't really use their degrees, if we're honest. You could have been making loads of money. And this is essentially the scam, because this is what rich people do. Is rich people get rich off of poor people by interest. That's how they do it. That's why usury is banned in all of the major religions, because it's where rich people exploit the poor people. And the example is the classic one of even something as simple as the 4% interest. If you put £50,000 getting 4% interest, you'd have £63,000 now. And that £13,000 interest, all the rich people who have their money gaining that interest is paid for by those paying interest for their student loans. Because if you think about it, when you're paying interest on your student loan, that money doesn't go to the bank. Well, it goes to the bank, but then the bank gives the interest to people who have it in their savings account. And this is how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, because the rich have assets and savings that accrue interest, whereas the poor get into debt, and that accentuates the problem because they pay interest on the debt that goes to the rich to make them richer. And that's why I advise all young people now is do not get into debt. And if there are some sensible debt, okay, if you get a mortgage or whatever, then so be it. Obviously, you have to get some form of a mortgage, most likely, to get a home. That's somewhat good debt because your house price is going to generally increase. Even though, as I said shortly before, go and check out my previous video, because under the new system that I advocate, there would be no interest accrued on mortgages. So it would be a brilliant system. But while we're in this current system, try as much as you can not to get in debt. Get a job, save money and invest money and advocate for change. And if you're at 16, if you left, got a job, started working full time, you'd save 2 years of college and probably 4 years of university and 1 gap year or whatever. So in 6 years, if you just save £300 a month, that'd be probably 20 grand you'd have. And if you learn to invest that wisely, even in safe assets like the stock market or gold or Bitcoin, you can probably turn that 20 grand into 50 grand. And then when you're 23 years old, what would you rather have? £50,000, or would you rather be £50,000 in debt for pretty much the rest of your life? And not only that, but when you go to university, you're not really picking up much education. You're picking up a lot of indoctrination. Whereas what you could be doing in those 6 years, you could be learning your own education. You could be learning to start your own business or your own side hustle. And you'll grow far, far much more taking your own path than you will going to university. And I can advocate that myself because I love spirituality and I'm self-taught in the last 15 years. And I feel going on my own personal journey, respecting a lot of educators, but learning myself, I feel I'm so much more closer to God than if I just went to like, I think what they have in America, they're called seminaries, where if you want to be like a Christian preacher, you go and you learn the Bible all day. But if I did that, I wouldn't be as close to God as what I am now. I wouldn't be as spiritually awake as what I am now and as close to the Father and Christ as what I am now. I'd just be regurgitating the Bible. And I'll be impressive because you could say to me, what is John verse 1-2? And I could spit it out straight away. And I could spit out verses that automatically come to mind. And it would seem intellectually impressive, but it's soulless. And I'm just essentially an AI robot who's learnt the Bible off by heart. And I know the teachings of man rather than the spiritual truth of Christ and the closeness to the Father and have the love of Father in me. And this is a gift from God, not from man. So I encourage young students, if you're 16, don't bother with college and university. Get a job, earn money, save the money, invest the money, and self-teach yourself. Learn as much, especially about spirituality, and then learning about the economy, learn about politics, and learn as much as you can on your own. With the age of the internet and you've got AI and all that, you can learn so much. Okay, so that's the point of my video today. I'm encouraging all young people, do not go to university and get into debt slavery. And this is also for your everyday person to understand that we, or the taxpayers, are paying off a lot of this student debt. So it affects all of us, and not to mention all the youngsters are getting brainwashed into this ridiculous system, destroying our country. And the education system is just one of many, many problems we have. And I'll explore many of these problems in other videos on this channel. So if you like what I'm talking about and you want to join a movement or help a movement that's going to solve the problems in our country, because it is a movement from God, Christ, and it is called the Way of the Logos UK. And once we follow the way of the Logos, which is the way of the Spirit, we will solve all our problems and make things so much better in this country. If you like what I'm talking about, like the video, subscribe if you're new, share it with as many people as you can, especially young people. If you know any 15, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, get this to them immediately so they know what they're getting themselves into. At the end of the day, you're an individual. You have the choice to make of whether you want to go. And in some cases, it may make sense to go to university. In rare cases, if you want to be a doctor, you've got no real choice. But I'm just trying to let you know how the system operates because you're not taught this. They want to keep you ignorant so that they can get you into slavery, but then you're screwed. Okay? God bless everybody today. Stay well. Goodbye.